Hey, say you should respect your elders, but what they really mean is you should never underestimate a woman who's had 80 years to learn exactly where the bodies are buried, and how to plant a prize-winning rose bush over them. Meet Granny. She's got a heart of gold, a secret recipe for everything, and absolutely zero patience for entitlement. From special glitter bomb packages for porch pirates to shutting down first-class seat demands with nothing but a knitting needle and a smile, she's seen every trick in the book. This isn't just a story about neighborhood squabbles, it's a masterclass in how to handle the Karens of the world with a little bit of sass, a lot of grace, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from a lifetime of outsmarting the neighborhood bully. Strap in, sugar. You're about to see why kindness always wins, and why you should never, ever touch Granny's gnome mural. Now, pull up a chair and let that tea steep for just a minute, because I've got a story for you that'll make your biscuits go cold if you aren't careful. You know, I've lived in this little house for 42 years, and my garden has always been my sanctuary. My hydrangeas are the size of dinner plates and my heirloom tomatoes are famous from here to the county line. But last spring, a new neighbor moved in next door, a woman named Brenda who wore heels to a backyard barbecue and looked at my flower beds like they were a personal insult. It started on a Tuesday morning. I was out there with my sun hat and my favorite trowel, just minding my business, when I heard the clicking of those heels on the pavement. Brenda didn't even say hello. She just marched right up to the edge of my marigolds, crossed her arms, and said, "You know, Gladys, I've had a surveyor look at the satellite imagery, and it turns out your garden is actually 3 feet over my property line." I just blinked at her, wiped the dirt off my hands, and said, "Honey, this fence has been here since Nixon was in office." But she wasn't having it. She told me she wanted those messy bushes gone by the weekend because she was planning to put in a sleek, gray gravel dog run. Gravel. Over my prize-winning perennials. I tried to be neighborly, I really did. I offered her a jar of my homemade preserves and suggested we look at the original plat maps together. She just huffed, called me old-fashioned, and told me if I didn't clear the land, she'd bring in a crew to do it for me. She thought because I have white hair and a soft spot for birds that I'd just roll over. But what Brenda didn't realize is that an American granny knows exactly where her roots are planted, and I had a little something tucked away in the attic that was about to turn her satellite imagery into a very expensive mistake. Well, while Brenda was busy stewing over property lines and fence posts, she decided to find a new way to get under my skin. You see, Brenda loved to host these influencer brunches, as she called them. Now, I don't mind a get-together, but my driveway is a narrow little slip of asphalt meant for my old Buick, not a staging ground for a fleet of white SUVs. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was expecting my grandson to drop by with the heavy bags of mulch I'd ordered. When I looked out the window, there it was, a shiny, oversized Rover parked right in the middle of my drive, blocking me in completely. I walked out in my slippers, thinking surely there'd been a mistake. I saw Brenda on her front porch, taking photos of her avocado toast, and I gave her a polite little wave. I said, "Brenda, dear, one of your guests seems to have missed the curb. I've got a delivery coming and need my driveway clear." She didn't even look up from her phone. She just waved a hand in the air like she was shooing a fly and said, "Oh, Gladys, don't be a prune. It's just for a few hours. There's nowhere else for them to park that doesn't ruin the aesthetic of my front lawn. Just tell the delivery boy to wait." I felt a little heat rise up in my neck, the kind that usually means I'm about to do something my mother would have called a firm. I told her, "Brenda, this isn't a valet service, and my driveway isn't an overflow lot." She actually laughed, a cold, sharp sound, and told me that since I never went anywhere anyway, I should be happy to contribute to the neighborhood's vibrant social scene. She thought I was just a lonely old woman who'd complain to the birds and do nothing. But she forgot one very important thing. My nephew, Dale, owns the local towing company, and he's been looking for an excuse to test out his new heavy-duty lift. I went back inside, poured myself a fresh glass of lemonade, and picked up the rotary phone. If Brenda wanted a vibrant scene, I was about to give her one she'd never forget. After Dale finished hauling that SUV away and the screech of those tires faded into the distance, I thought Brenda might have learned that neighborly goes both ways. But instead of cooling off, she decided to take our little spat to the High Court of Suburbia, the Homeowners Association. You see, Brenda had managed to get herself appointed as the aesthetic compliance chair, and she decided her first order of business was to go after my front yard. I've had a collection of ceramic lawn gnomes for nearly 30 years. There's Barnaby with his fishing pole, Petunia in her little sunbonnet, and a dozen others tucked among the hydrangeas. They're part of the family, really. But on Monday morning, I found a bright orange notice of violation taped right to my front door. The letter claimed my gnomes were non-traditional yard ornaments that didn't align with the new, modern minimalist guidelines Brenda had drafted herself. She had the audacity to fine me $50 a day for every day those tacky figurines remained on display. When I saw her pulling her trash cans to the curb, I walked down with the orange paper in my hand. I said, "Brenda, these gnomes have been the neighborhood mascot since before you were born. The children love searching for them on their way to school." She just adjusted her designer sunglasses and gave me a look that could have curdled milk. She said, "Gladys, we're trying to raise the property values here, and your whimsical clutter is a visual eyesore. Either the gnomes go, or we'll place a lien on your house. It's all in the bylaws." She looked so smug standing there, thinking she'd trapped me with a clipboard and a fancy title. But Brenda made one fatal mistake: she hadn't actually read the original 1974 HOA charter. My late husband, Henry, was one of the founding members of this association, and he was a man who believed in the fine print. I knew for a fact that there was a legacy clause buried in those dusty old pages that protected any original landscaping features. I went back inside, put on my reading glasses, and started digging through the filing cabinet. It was time to show Brenda that while she had the title, I had the history, and a gnome named Barnaby who wasn't going anywhere without a fight. When Brenda realized her little HOA coup had hit a brick wall, or rather, a gnome-shaped legacy clause, she didn't just back down. No, that woman's pride was more stubborn than a weed in a sidewalk crack. She decided that if she couldn't control what was in my yard, she simply wouldn't look at it. She sent me a formal, certified letter stating that she was exercising her right to install a privacy barrier along our shared property line. She hired a crew to put up a 6-foot-tall, solid industrial vinyl fence. Now, normally, I wouldn't mind a bit of privacy, but Brenda chose the most hideous shade of corporate cubicle gray you've ever seen. And the way she positioned it? It was clearly meant to block the sunlight from my prize-winning rose bushes. She stood out there while the post holes were being dug, smirking at me, and shouted, "If I have to live next to a museum of tacky gnomes, Gladys, I'm going to make sure nobody else has to see them, or you." I just sat on my porch swing, sipping my tea and watching them work. You see, Brenda was so focused on the height of the fence that she forgot to check the local zoning ordinances regarding finished sides. In our county, the law is very specific that a pretty side of a fence, the smooth, finished part, must face the neighbor. The ugly side, with all the rough posts and horizontal supports, must face the owner. The moment they finished, Brenda had a jagged, skeletal mess of gray plastic bars facing her kitchen window, while I had a perfectly smooth, clean surface facing mine. But I didn't stop there. I remembered another rule: there's no law against what color you paint your side of a neighbor's fence, as long as it doesn't damage the structure. I called up my grandson and we went to the hardware store for the brightest, most neon of sunset orange and electric purple outdoor paint they had. While Brenda was inside celebrating her new wall, we turned my side of that fence into a glorious, vibrant mural of giant, oversized gnomes dancing under a rainbow. Every time she looked out her second-story window, she didn't see her minimalist paradise, she saw the very things she hated, amplified 10 times larger and glowing in the sun. She had built the canvas, and I simply provided the art. It was the most beautiful spite fence in the history of the county. By the time the paint on my gnome glow mural was dry, you'd think Brenda would have waved the white flag. But some people just can't stand to see a neighbor happy, especially one they can't bully. That's when things took a turn from petty to just plain dishonest. I started noticing that my delivery packages, the ones with my knitting yarn, my specialty birdseed, and my vitamins, were disappearing right off my front porch before I could even get to the door. Now, I'm an old woman, but I'm not unobservant. I noticed a certain gray SUV idling a little too close to my curb every time the delivery truck rattled down the street. One afternoon, through the sheer lace curtains of my parlor, I saw a familiar pair of designer heels scurrying up my walkway. Brenda snatched a box of my organic peppermint tea, tucked it under her arm, and sprinted back to her house like she just won a marathon. I felt a pang of sadness, really. Imagine having a house that big and a heart that small. But I knew better than to just wag my finger at her. I decided to cook up a little something special, and no, it wasn't a pie. I took an old, empty shipping box and filled it with a concoction I like to call Granny's Surprise. It was a pressurized mixture of ultrafine pink glitter, a generous helping of expired fish sauce from the back of the pantry, and a spring-loaded mechanism my grandson helped me rig up. I taped it up nice and neat, set it right on my porch, and sat back with my knitting. It didn't take 20 minutes. Brenda's front door creaked open, she did a quick scan of the street, and zip, she grabbed the trap and disappeared back inside. About 30 seconds later, a scream echoed across the property line that was so loud it startled the blue jays right out of the oak trees. Then came the sound of a window being slammed open and the frantic coughing. You see, that glitter is the kind that never truly leaves your carpet, and that fish sauce? Well, that's a scent that lingers in a minimalist living room for weeks. I just sat on my porch, took a slow sip of my tea, and smiled at my beautiful purple fence. Brenda wanted what was mine, so I made sure she got exactly what she deserved: sparkles, a bit of a stink, and a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. After Tiffany went scurrying off to find a new inheritance to circle, I thought the family drama had reached its peak for the season. But then came my granddaughter Sarah's wedding. It was supposed to be a quiet, elegant affair in the garden, the very one I'd fought so hard to protect. Sarah looked like an absolute angel in her grandmother's lace, and for a moment, the world felt perfectly still. That is, until the distinct sound of a gravel-crunching entrance announced the arrival of Aunt Beatrice. Now, Beatrice hadn't been on the guest list for very good reasons, mostly involving a scene she made at a funeral back in '09, but there she was, draped in a dress that was practically incandescent white. You never wear white to a wedding unless you're the one saying "I do," but Beatrice has always thought the world was her stage and we were all just the stagehands. She marched right past the guest book, cornered the photographer, and started demanding he take candid shots of her posing by the fountain. When Sarah's mother, my daughter, tried to gently suggest that Beatrice might be more comfortable at the local diner, Beatrice let out a wail that could have woken the dead. She claimed she was being ostracized by her own flesh and blood and then had the nerve to walk right up to the head table. She picked up a glass of champagne, clinked it with a butter knife, and announced to the 100 or so guests that she had a special announcement about her own upcoming cruise. I could see Sarah's lower lip starting to tremble, and that was all the signal I needed. I didn't raise my voice, I just stood up, smoothed out my apron, and walked over with a fresh plate of my extra sticky honey-glazed ribs. I leaned in close and whispered, "Beatrice, dear, you have two choices. You can sit in that back corner and eat these ribs in silence, or I can tell the entire congregation the real story of what happened to the church organ fund back in 1994. She turned a shade of red that matched the cocktail sauce. She took the ribs, sat in the very last row, and didn't utter another peep for the rest of the night. You see, an American granny knows where all the skeletons are buried, and she isn't afraid to bring a shovel to a wedding if it means protecting her granddaughter's big day. After Beatrice finished her ribs in the back row and the wedding guests had danced their last dance, I thought we could finally put the family theatrics to bed. But the Monday after a wedding is when the real characters come out of the woodwork. I was sitting in my breakfast nook, helping Sarah sort through the beautiful gifts and cards, when there was a sharp, demanding rap at the kitchen door. I opened it to find Beatrice again, looking far less glamorous than she did in her white dress. She didn't even ask how the bride was feeling. Instead, she marched in, set a fancy-looking boutique bag on my counter, and said, "Gladys, I've been thinking. That crystal vase I brought for Sarah? It's far too fragile for a young couple starting out. I've decided to take it back and just give them the cash equivalent instead. It's much more practical." Sarah looked confused and said, "Oh, Aunt Beatrice, that's so thoughtful, but I don't remember seeing a vase from you." Beatrice's face went stiff as a board. She started huffing about how disorganized young people are these days and claimed she'd personally placed a $300 hand-blown centerpiece on the gift table during the reception. She even produced a crumpled receipt from her purse, demanding I reimburse her right then and there because she had a pressing bill to pay. I looked at that receipt, then I looked at the boutique bag, which, if I recall correctly, was the same one my daughter had used to carry her extra shoes. I reached into my kitchen drawer and pulled out the master gift log I'd kept during the setup. I've lived through enough church bazaars to know you track every item that crosses the threshold. I leaned over the counter and said, "Beatrice, honey, I've got the list right here. We have the silver platters, the linens, and even a lovely toaster from your brother. But the only thing you brought into that garden was a hearty appetite and a white dress that broke 3 different social rules. Now, if you're looking for $300, you might find it in that organ fund we discussed on Saturday, but you won't find it in my granddaughter's pocket." She didn't even argue. She grabbed her empty bag and vanished down the driveway faster than a cat in a dog show. Some people think a wedding is a payout, but a granny knows the difference between a gift and a grift every single time. After the gift return fiasco, you'd think the family would want a nice long break from one another. But the Miller family reunion was already on the books, and when that many personalities get together under one pavilion, someone is bound to boil over. This year, my cousin Martha's daughter-in-law, Sheila, had volunteered to coordinate the event at the local lakeside lodge. Sheila married into money a few years back, and she's been acting like her blood runs blue ever since. I arrived early with my potato salad, the one with the secret touch of mustard seed, only to find Sheila standing at the entrance of the lodge like a velvet rope at a fancy club. She was wearing a crisp white linen suit that had no business being within 10 miles of a charcoal grill. As our cousins from the valley started pulling up in their dusty work trucks, Sheila's face went sour. "These are good, hard-working folks, the kind who'll give you the shirt off their back but might have a little grease under their fingernails." Sheila pulled me aside, whispering loud enough for the birds to hear, "Gladys, we really need to maintain a certain standard for the lodge photos. I've decided to move the informal group to the picnic benches down by the swampy end of the lake. We'll keep the indoor air conditioning and the catered hors d'oeuvres for the primaried family members." I felt a spark in my chest that had nothing to do with heartburn. "Primary family?" I asked. She had the nerve to tell me that the aesthetic of the reunion was being ruined by rusty tailgates and off-brand soda. She actually started telling the Valley cousins that the lodge was at capacity, and they'd be happier down in the dirt with the mosquitoes. I didn't make a scene. I just walked over to the lodge manager, a man I've known since he was in diapers, and asked for the microphone. I announced to the whole room, "Attention everyone. Sheila here has a bit of a misunderstanding about who paid the deposit for this beautiful lodge. Since this building was donated to the town by my late husband's foundation, I believe that a standard for today is that every single person with Miller blood gets a seat at the main table, and those who think they're too fancy for their own kin are more than welcome to go sit in their luxury cars with the windows rolled up." Sheila's jaw dropped so low she could have tripped over it. She realized she was the only one standing between a family and their heritage. Needless to say, we all ate inside together, and that potato salad tasted just a little bit sweeter knowing that poor is a matter of the pocketbook, but a cheap is a matter of the heart. After the reunion dust settled in, Sheila finally realized that her linen suit didn't make her the queen of the county. Things took a more somber, but very revealing turn. "You see, my dear sister-in-law, Martha, finally went to be with the Lord." Martha was as sharp as a tack and twice as prickly when it came to her finances, and she'd spent years watching her son's wife, Sheila, treat the family like second-class citizens. When it came time for the reading of the will, Sheila showed up in a black veil so heavy you'd think she was auditioning for a silent movie, clutching a calculator instead of a handkerchief. We all gathered in the lawyer's office, a room that smelled of old paper and justice. Sheila was practically vibrating in her chair, already talking about the total renovation she was going to do to Martha's historic cottage. The lawyer, a man with a voice like dry leaves, cleared his throat and started reading. Martha had left her a very substantial sum, a life-changing amount of money, but there was a tiny, bolded paragraph at the bottom that made Sheila's face go pale. It was the 90-day character clause. Martha had stipulated that before a single cent was transferred, the beneficiary had to complete 90 days of documented community service at the local soup kitchen, the very one Sheila had called an eyesore just the month before. Not only that, but the will stated that if the beneficiary committed any act of public disparagement toward a family member during that time, the entire inheritance would be forfeited and donated to, you guessed it, the Valley Cousins Scholarship Fund. Sheila lost her mind. She stood up and shrieked that Martha was senile and vindictive, calling the whole family a bunch of backwoods scavengers. She went on a 10-minute tirade that the lawyer recorded with a very calm, very professional smile. When she finally ran out of breath, he simply tapped the recorder and said, "Well, Sheila, that was 30 seconds into your 90 days, and I believe you just disparaged the entire room. According to the 90-day rule, you've officially disqualified yourself." She walked out of there with nothing but her expensive shoes and a whole lot of empty air. Martha knew that money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy a soul, and she made sure that the only people who inherited her hard-earned life were the ones who knew how to treat people with a little bit of grace. After seeing Sheila storm out of that lawyer's office with nothing but a bitter taste in her mouth, I decided I needed a little change of scenery. I headed down to the Thimble and Thread, the little boutique quilting shop I've owned for 30 years. I don't get behind the counter as much these days. I usually leave that to the younger folks, but I still like to put on my plain green work apron and organize the fat quarters when I need to clear my head. I was in the back corner, quietly tidying up some vintage calico, when the front chimes let out a frantic jingle. In marched a woman who looked like she'd been born with a permanent scowl. She was holding a bolt of premium silk that had clearly been cut, handled, and, if my nose didn't deceive me, doused in a healthy amount of cheap perfume. She slammed it onto the counter where my youngest employee, a sweet girl named Lily, was working. "This is defective," the woman barked. "I bought this yesterday, and the color is all wrong for my dining room. I want a full cash refund, and I want an extra $50 for the gas I wasted driving back here." Poor Lily tried to explain that once fabric is cut, we can't take it back, especially not when it's been stained. But this woman wasn't listening. She leaned over the counter, pointing a manicured finger, and screamed, "I don't care about your little rules. You're just a low-level clerk. Get me the manager right now before I have this pathetic little shack shut down." I took a slow breath, smoothed out my apron, and walked over with my most pleasant grandmother smile. I said, "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" She didn't even look at my face, she just saw my dusty apron and snapped, "Great, another one. Listen, Granny, go find me someone with actual authority. I want the manager, and I want them 5 minutes ago." I leaned in, rested my elbows on the glass counter, and said, "Well, sugar, I'm afraid I can't find the manager for you. But I can tell you that as the woman whose name is on the deed to this building, the business license on that wall, and the paycheck Lily here is holding, I'm the owner. And the owner says that since you've ruined my silk and insulted my staff, you have exactly 10 seconds to take your defective fabric and your bad attitude out of my shop before I call the sheriff, who, by the way, happens to be my godson." The way her face went from bright red to ghostly white was a thing of beauty. She snatched her bag and bolted. It just goes to show, you should never judge a book by its cover, or a shopkeeper by her apron. After that woman scurried out of my quilt shop, I realized I'd worked up quite an appetite. I decided to stop by the local market to pick up the fixings for my Sunday pot roast. Now, the grocery store on a Friday afternoon is usually a friendly place, but there's always one person who treats a shopping aisle like a Formula One racetrack. I was finishing up in the produce section, carefully selecting the best golden potatoes, when I noticed my dear friend Mrs. Higgins. Now, Mrs. Higgins is 89 years young and moves at a pace that can only be described as thoughtful. She had a cart full of carefully selected items, including the last 2 containers of the store's famous pre-made chicken salad that everyone in town fights over. Suddenly, a woman in a jogging suit, who looked like she was in a life-or-death hurry to be nowhere in particular, came screeching around the corner. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh right behind Mrs. Higgins and started checking her watch every 3 seconds. When Mrs. Higgins reached for a bunch of bananas, the woman snapped. She didn't just push past, she actually reached out, grabbed the handle of Mrs. Higgins' cart, and tried to pull it away. "You're taking too long," the woman yelled. "You clearly don't even know what you're looking for, and I have a spin class in 20 minutes. I'm taking this cart because it already has everything I need anyway. You can just start over, you've got nothing but time." Mrs. Higgins just stood there, clutching her purse, looking absolutely stunned. I didn't even think, I just pushed my own cart forward until it blocked the woman's path. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Now, hold on just a minute, sunshine. Around here, we don't hijack a neighbor's groceries just because we can't manage our own schedule." The woman turned on me, her face contorted. "Mind your business, old lady. She's too slow to be out in public." "Well," I said, my voice as calm as a summer pond, "I might be an old lady, but I'm an old lady who knows the store manager, and I'm also the one currently standing on the wheel of your stolen cart." I leaned in a little closer and added, "You have 2 choices, you can apologize to Mrs. Higgins and go find your own chicken salad, or we can wait right here for security to review the footage of you assaulting a senior citizen for a head of lettuce." She looked around and realized the entire produce department was staring at her with narrowed eyes. She let go of the cart so fast you'd think it was made of hot coals and practically ran toward the exit. I just patted Mrs. Higgins on the arm and helped her pick out the best bananas. In this life, you can be fast or you can be slow, but you should never be so rushed that you forget how to be human. After I got Mrs. Higgins settled with her groceries, I realized I was far too tired to cook that pot roast myself. I decided to treat myself to a quiet dinner at the Silver Diner, a local landmark where the coffee is always hot and the staff feels like family. I was tucked into my favorite corner booth, just enjoying the hum of the evening, when a woman 2 tables over started making enough noise to rattle the silverware. She was dressed in one of those stiff power suits and had a face that looked like she'd been sucking on a lemon for a week. She finished every last bite of her steak, licked the plate clean of the garlic mashed potatoes, and then slammed her napkin down like she was declaring war. When the young waiter, a sweet boy named Toby who's working his way through nursing school, brought the check, she let out a scoff that stopped every conversation in the room. "I'm not paying for this," she announced, crossing her arms. Toby looked confused and asked if something was wrong with the meal. She looked him up and down and said, "The meal was adequate, but the service was a disaster. Look at this water. The ice melted too fast, making it far too wet and diluted. It completely ruined the palate of my steak. I want this entire bill voided, or I'll see to it that this place gets a 1-star review before I hit the parking lot." Poor Toby just stood there, blinking. I've seen a lot of excuses for a free meal in my time, too salty, too cold, even too much garnish, but the water was too wet was a new one, even for me. I saw the manager heading over, looking ready to give in just to stop the shouting, but I couldn't sit idly by and watch Toby get bullied by a woman who'd clearly just eaten a $30 dinner for free. I slid out of my booth, walked over, and tapped my finger on her empty plate. I said, "Excuse me, dear, but I couldn't help but notice that for someone whose palate was ruined, you sure didn't leave a single scrap for the kitchen dog." She started to snap at me, but I just kept right on going. You know, the funny thing about wet water is that it's usually a sign that the laws of physics are working. But the law that's about to work here is theft of services. Now, you can pay Toby here for that steak you clearly enjoyed, or I can call my friend at the local paper and let her know that the town's newest food critic doesn't understand how ice works." The woman looked at the empty plate, then at the crowded diner full of people shaking their heads, and finally at Toby. She threw a handful of crumpled bills on the table and practically tripped over her own feet getting out the door. I just winked at Toby and told him to keep the change as an extra wet water bonus. Some folks will try any trick in the book to feel powerful, but they usually forget that common sense doesn't cost a dime, and neither does being decent. After Toby's extra wet water tip was tucked safely in his pocket, I decided it was time for a real getaway. My sister down in Florida had been begging me to visit, so I packed my bags and headed for the airport. Now, I usually don't mind flying. I like to sit by the window and look at the clouds like they're giant puffs of whipped cream, but an airport is like a magnifying glass for folks who think the world revolves around them. I'd treated myself to a first-class seat using my miles from 30 years of grocery shopping. I was just getting settled in, tucking my knitting bag under the seat, when a woman came marching down the aisle trailing a boy who was at least 6'2" and had a 5 o'clock shadow. She stopped right at my row, looked at me like I was a piece of gum on her shoe, and then looked at the flight attendant. "Excuse me," she barked, "but there's been a mistake. I'm back in row 34, but I have a child with me. He's very sensitive and needs the extra legroom and the hot towel service for his nerves. I need this lady to swap seats with us immediately. It's for the welfare of the child." The flight attendant, a patient woman who looked like she'd seen it all, leaned in and asked how old the child was. The woman didn't miss a beat. "He's my baby. He's 17, but he's very delicate." The boy himself looked like he wanted to crawl into the luggage bin and hide, but his mother was just getting started. She turned to me and said, "Come on, move it, Granny. You've had 70 years of legroom. My son has his whole life ahead of him and he shouldn't have to spend 5 hours with his knees hitting the seat in front of him. Be a good person for once and give up the seat." I just looked up at her, adjusted my spectacles, and said, "Well, honey, if he's 17 and that tall, I'd say he's not a child, he's a man. And if he's a man, he's old enough to know that you don't ask an elderly woman to move to the back of the plane just because you didn't want to pay the upgrade fee." She started shrieking about ageist discrimination and how she was going to have the pilot fired. I just leaned back, pulled out my knitting needles, and said, "Sugar, the only thing delicate here is your grasp on reality. If your son is that sensitive, perhaps he'd like to borrow my earplugs, because you're being awfully loud." The flight attendant finally told her she could either go back to row 34 or be escorted off the plane for causing a disturbance. She huffed so hard she nearly blew my hat off, but she stomped her way to the back. I just looked at the boy as he passed and whispered, "Good luck, dear. You're going to need it." Sometimes people think having a child is a golden ticket, but a granny knows that a baby who can shave is just a man with a very entitled mother. I finally touched down in Florida, but after all that excitement on the plane, I realized I'd left my blood pressure medication back on my nightstand in Georgia. So, my first stop wasn't the beach, it was the local pharmacy. It was one of those humid afternoons where the air feels like a warm blanket, and it seemed like half the town had the same idea I did. The line was long, snaking past the greeting cards and the sunscreen, but we were all being patient, chatting quietly and enjoying the air conditioning. I was third in line, right behind a young man in scrubs and an elderly gentleman using a walker. We were all shuffling along just fine until the automatic doors hissed open and a woman in a bright yellow tracksuit charged in. She didn't even look at the 20 people standing in line. She marched straight to the front, shoulder-checked the gentleman with the walker, and slammed her insurance card onto the counter. The pharmacist, a tired-looking man named Arthur, said, "Ma'am, there is a line. You'll need to take a number and wait your turn like everyone else." She didn't even blink. She leaned over the counter and said, "Do you have any idea who I am? My time is billed at $200 an hour. I don't wait in lines with people like this. It's soul-crushing to stand around doing nothing." Just give me my prescription and I'll be out of your hair." The gentleman with the walker almost lost his balance from her push, and that was the last straw for me. I stepped out of line and said, "Excuse me, sugar, but if your soul is so fragile that standing in line for 10 minutes crushes it, you might want to skip the pharmacy and head straight to a church. We're all tired, and some of us actually need our legs to stay under us." She turned around and looked at me with pure venom. "Stay out of this, you old bat. I'm more important than any of you." Well, that was the magic word. You see, when you call a granny a bat, in a room full of people who were raised right, the atmosphere changes. The young man in scrubs stepped up beside me. Then the lady behind me. Pretty soon, the whole line was closing in, not with anger, but with a wall of quiet, firm disapproval. One man at the back shouted, "If she's so expensive, maybe she can pay for all our prescriptions while she waits at the back." She looked around at the sea of faces, young, old, and everything in between, and realized she didn't have a single friend in that room. Arthur the pharmacist just pointed to the very back of the store and said, "The line starts by the diapers, ma'am. I suggest you get moving." She huffed, calling us all soulless peasants, but she slunk to the back of the line anyway. It just goes to show you, no matter how much you think your time is worth, it's never worth more than your manners. Now, you'd think that after being humbled at the pharmacy, a person might take a long look in the mirror and decide to change their ways. But Brenda, remember my neighbor with the minimalist gravel and the glittery living room? Well, she decided she hadn't had enough of the spotlight just yet. She actually had the gall to sue me in small claims court for emotional distress and property devaluation because of my no mural. I showed up to the courthouse in my best floral Sunday dress, carrying nothing but a small manila folder. Brenda, on the other hand, marched in looking like she was ready to argue before the Supreme Court. She'd decided to represent herself because, in her words, no lawyer in this town was smart enough to understand her vision. She had 3 binders full of evidence, a portable easel, and a look on her face that said she'd already won. When the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Miller, asked Brenda to state her case, it was like watching a dam burst. Brenda spent 20 minutes talking about aesthetic terrorism, the psychological trauma of seeing a neon-colored gnome at sunrise, and how my unauthorized art had knocked $50,000 off her home's value. She even tried to submit a scientific study. She printed off a conspiracy blog about how bright colors cause migraines. The judge just sat there, rubbing her temples, and finally said, "Ms. Brenda, do you have any actual legal statutes that were violated?" Brenda puffed out her chest and said, "It's common sense, Your Honor. My property is a temple of neutral tones, and that woman turned the border into a circus. I demand she pays for a professional sandblasting and gives me $10,000 for my pain and suffering." Then it was my turn. I didn't need an easel. I just stood up and handed the judge 2 pieces of paper. I said, "Your Honor, the first paper is the county ordinance stating that the pretty side of a fence belongs to the neighbor, and the owner has no say over how that neighbor decorates it. The second is the 1974 HOA charter Brenda herself tried to use against me, which specifically protects legacy artistic expressions on the property." The judge looked at the papers, looked at Brenda's neon orange evidence photos, and then looked at Brenda. She didn't even leave the bench to deliberate. She leaned into the microphone and said, "Case dismissed. And Ms. Brenda, if you ever bring this much nonsense into my courtroom again, I'll fine you for wasting the taxpayers' time. This isn't a fashion show, it's a court of law." Brenda stood there with her mouth open, her binders scattering all over the floor. I just gathered my purse, gave her a sweet little wave, and said, "Have a blessed day, dear. I've got a new batch of purple paint waiting for me at home." Some people think they can talk their way into a victory, but a granny knows that the truth doesn't need a binder, it just needs the facts. I thought the courthouse would be the end of it, but Brenda had a way of doubling down when most folks would have tucked tail and run. About a week after the judge sent her packing, I was out in the front yard, minding my own business and deadheading my marigolds. I heard the screech of a high-end hybrid car and looked up to see Brenda standing on her lawn, pointing her phone at me like it was a weapon. She was shouting into it, her voice cracking with a frantic kind of glee. "Yes, officer, she's doing it again. She's brandishing a sharp weapon and trespassing on my property. I feel threatened for my life. Hurry." I just stood there, holding my blunt-nosed garden shears and looking at the 3-foot gap between me and her property line. About 10 minutes later, 2 squad cars pulled up, lights flashing. Out stepped Officer Miller, my godson Dale's youngest, and another young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Brenda ran toward them, practically tripping over her own gravel, screaming about dangerous senior citizens and constant harassment. Officer Miller walked over to me, tipped his hat, and said, "Afternoon, Gladys. Brenda here says you're making threats with a deadly weapon. You planning on pruning the air or something?" I just laughed and offered him a sprig of fresh lavender. I told him, "Well, Dale, I was just trying to give these flowers some room to breathe, but apparently, my gardening is a matter of national security today." Dale turned to Brenda, who was still filming and demanding my immediate arrest. He looked at her phone, then he looked at the clear property markers, those little stakes I'd had professionally installed after our first war. He sighed and said, "Ma'am, you called 911 for an emergency. This isn't an emergency. This is a woman trimming her own bushes on her own land. In fact, on my body camera footage, I can see you're the one who crossed over to her side to shout at her." He then informed her that filing a false police report is a serious offense, and since this was the 3rd time she called about my suspicious gardening, he was issuing her a citation for misuse of emergency services. Brenda's face turned a shade of magenta I haven't even seen in my flower beds. She went from being the victim to being the one getting a lecture on the hood of a police car. As they drove off, I just waved my shears and went back to my marigolds. It's a funny thing about calling for help. If you're the one causing the trouble, help is the last thing you're going to get. You know, they say the internet is written in ink, not pencil, and Brenda was about to learn that lesson the hard way. While she was busy filming me with her phone, she forgot that the neighborhood kids were filming her right back. One of the teenagers from down the block had captured the whole scene, the screaming, the false accusations to the police, and that final, foot-stomping tantrum she threw when she got her citation. By the next morning, that video had more views than a cat playing the piano. Now, Brenda always bragged about her high-powered job at a fancy regional bank. She loved to tell us all how she was the face of corporate integrity. Well, it turns out that corporate integrity doesn't look too kindly on a vice president who spends her Saturday afternoon shrieking at an elderly woman over a marigold. On Monday morning, instead of her usual aggressive power walk to her car, Brenda stayed inside. The silence was almost eerie. Around noon, I saw her come out onto the porch, but the fire was gone. She looked like a balloon that had lost all its air. Apparently, her boss had seen the video, the one titled, "Entitled Neighbor Fakes 911 Call," and decided that Brenda's aesthetic wasn't quite a match for the bank's community values anymore. She had been relieved of her duties, as the HR folks like to say. When I saw her sitting on her steps, staring at that gray gravel dog run of hers, I almost felt a twinge of pity. Almost. I walked to the edge of the fence, the smooth, mural-covered side, and I said, "Brenda, I heard the news. I'm truly sorry it had to come to this." She looked up, her eyes red, and she didn't even have a snarky comeback left. She just whispered, "It was just a garden, Gladys. How did it get this far?" I told her, "It was never about the garden, sugar. It was about how you treat people when you think nobody's watching. The problem is, in this day and age, someone is always watching." She just nodded and went back inside to start packing. It's a heavy thing to lose a career over a flower bed, but an American granny knows that your character is the only thing you truly own, and if you bankrupt that, no amount of money in a vault can save you. After losing her fancy corner office and realizing the whole town had seen her true colors on their phone screens, Brenda decided she needed to do some damage control. Now, in my day, an apology meant coming over with a humble heart and maybe a loaf of banana bread. But Brenda? She decided to turn her apology into a theatrical production. She posted a notice on the neighborhood app that she was holding a community healing circle on her front lawn to clear the air. I walked over, curious as a cat, along with about a dozen other neighbors. Brenda had set up a ring of folding chairs and was wearing a soft, beige sweater that I suppose was meant to make her look approachable. She stood in the center, holding a tablet, and started reading from a script that sounded like it had been written by a lawyer trying to be a poet. She said, "I want to apologize to anyone who may have felt misunderstood by my passion for neighborhood standards. I've realized that my high-level professional stress caused me to react to Gladys's unique choices in a way that wasn't optimal for my brand." She actually used the word brand, sugar. She went on to say that she was forgiving us for our part in the drama and that she was willing to move past the glitter incident if we all agreed to chip in for a new, professionally designed communal fence. She wasn't apologizing for being mean, she was apologizing because she got caught. She kept saying, "I'm sorry you felt that way," which is just a fancy way of saying she wasn't sorry at all. Then, she had the nerve to ask if I'd be willing to sign a statement of reconciliation that she could send to her old boss to show how much she'd grown. I just stood up, smoothed my dress, and said, "Brenda, honey, a real apology doesn't come with a contract or a request for a job recommendation. It comes with a change of heart. You're not sorry you hurt your neighbors, you're just sorry you lost your paycheck." The healing circle broke up pretty fast after that. Most folks just walked away, shaking their heads. You can't fix a hole in a relationship with a PR stunt any more than you can fix a broken vase with a coat of paint. She tried to make it right, but all she did was remind us why we stayed away from her in the first place. Some people are so busy trying to save their image that they forget they have an actual life to live. I watched Brenda's healing circle, the chairs get folded up for the last time, and I felt a stillness settle over the neighborhood that had been missing for a long, long time. I walked back to my porch, sat in my old wicker rocker, and watched the sun dip low behind my purple fence. The colors seemed to glow in that golden hour, a vibrant reminder of every battle fought with a paintbrush instead of a fist. You know, people often ask me why I didn't just give in to the Brendas or the Sheilas of the world. They ask why I didn't just paint the fence gray or hand over the inheritance to avoid the fuss. But it was never really about a fence or a bank account. It was about the simple truth that entitlement is a fire that never stops burning until it's consumed everything in its path. If you feed it, it only grows hungrier. Kindness, on the other hand, is like a garden. It takes time to grow, it requires a lot of patience, and sometimes you have to pull a few weeds to keep it healthy. But at the end of the day, kindness is the only thing that actually builds a home. Brenda had a house, but she never had a home, because she forgot that your neighbors aren't obstacles, they're your safety net. I've lived a long life, and I've seen a lot of folks try to scream and stomp their way to the front of the line. They might get there for a moment, but they usually find themselves standing all alone when they arrive. Real power isn't about having the loudest voice or the most expensive shoes, it's about having a heart that people actually want to be near. So, if you ever find yourself facing down a Karen of your own, just remember, you don't have to lower yourself to their level to win. You just have to stand your ground with grace, keep your sense of humor tucked in your pocket, and never, ever be afraid to add a little glitter to the world when things get too gray. Life is far too short to spend it being miserable, and it's much too sweet to spend it being mean. I think I'll head inside now and bake a tray of cookies for the teenagers down the block. They did a fine job with that video, after all. Take care of yourselves, darlings, and remember, be kind, but don't take any wooden nickels. If you enjoyed seeing Brenda get her glittery comeuppance or felt a little cheer when the 90-day rule kicked in, don't keep the satisfaction to yourself. Subscribe and ring the bell, join our neighborhood so you never miss a chapter of Granny's wit and wisdom. Share the love, send this to that one friend who's currently dealing with a Brenda of their own, they might need the inspiration, join the conversation, drop a comment below and tell us, What's the most entitled thing you've ever witnessed, and how did you handle it? Granny loves a good story. Stay sweet, stay sharp, and remember that a pretty side of the fence belongs to you.